My name is Olivia Johnson. I'm 28 years old, and I never thought my own family would abandon me in a foreign country, like I was nothing more than a piece of luggage they didn't want to carry anymore. At the airport in Paris, they canceled my ticket, took my phone, and left me standing there with nothing but a suitcase and a crushing realization that the people I trusted most had orchestrated my humiliation. What happened next changed everything. I thought I knew about loyalty, power, and what it truly means to stand on your own 2 feet. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. You won't believe what happened when a complete stranger in an expensive suit walked up to me in that crowded terminal and whispered something that made my blood run cold. Trust me, they'll regret it. I didn't know who he was, what he wanted, or why he was talking to me, but something in his eyes told me he understood exactly what had just happened. That moment became the turning point between the person I used to be and the person I was about to become. Have you ever been betrayed by the people who were supposed to protect you? Let me know in the comments. Now, you're probably wondering how my own family could betray me like this, right? At the airport, they abandoned me. A billionaire whispered a lie. Trust me, they'll regret it. Well, let me take you back to where it all started, because this wasn't just about a canceled plane ticket. This was about years of control disguised as concern, manipulation wrapped in family dinners, and a carefully constructed narrative that painted me as the unstable one who needed to be managed. Before I tell you what happened next, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a like, because what comes next is going to show you exactly how I turned their cruelty into my greatest comeback. The thing about my family is that they never yelled, never screamed, never made a scene that anyone could point to and say, "That's abuse." Instead, they used silence like a weapon, withdrawal like punishment, and logistics like chains. My older brother Marcus had always been the golden child, the one who made all the right choices, married the right woman, and never questioned our parents' authority. My younger sister Emily followed his lead perfectly, playing the role of the dutiful daughter who never caused problems. And then there was me, the one who asked too many questions, who wanted to live differently, who dared to suggest that maybe, just maybe, we didn't have to do things the way they'd always been done. The Paris trip was supposed to be a family reunion, a chance to reconnect after I'd spent 2 years building my career in another state, putting distance between myself and their constant need to control every aspect of my life. I'd paid for my own ticket initially, but my mother Claire insisted they'd take care of everything as a gift. As a gesture of reconciliation. I should have known better, but I wanted to believe that things could be different, that they'd finally see me as an adult capable of making my own decisions. It's like when someone offers you a life raft in the middle of the ocean. You don't question whether it has holes in it, you just grab on and hope. That hope made me vulnerable, and they knew exactly how to exploit it. When I arrived at the airport that morning, everything seemed normal at first. We checked in together, went through security, and I remember Marcus joking about how he'd finally get to try authentic French croissants. But then, right before boarding, my mother pulled me aside with a concerned look on her face and said she needed to hold on to my documents for safekeeping because I'd been so scattered lately. My phone, she said, should stay with Emily because the international plan was confusing, and she'd already set everything up on her device. My ticket, she assured me, was already loaded digitally on her phone along with everyone else's. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of how they'd systematically strip away every tool I had to advocate for myself or escape what was coming next. Standing at the gate, I watched them board one by one, Marcus first with his wife Jennifer, then Emily giggling about something on her phone, and finally my parents walking through without even a glance back in my direction. The gate agent had just told me there was no ticket under my name, no reservation, nothing in the system that proved I was supposed to be on that flight. My stomach dropped like I'd been pushed off a cliff, and when I turned to call out to my family, they were already down the jetway, completely out of sight. It wasn't until that exact moment that I realized this wasn't a mistake or a technical glitch. This was intentional, calculated, and cruelly precise. I tried to explain to the gate agent that my mother had my documents, that there must be some confusion, but without identification or proof of purchase, I was just another frantic passenger holding up the line. Other travelers started sighing and checking their watches. their impatience adding another layer of humiliation to what was already the most degrading moment of my life. The agent suggested I contact my family, but of course I had no phone. Emily had it, remember? It's like being locked in a room and realizing the person who has the key is the same person who locked you in. The powerlessness was suffocating, and I could feel panic starting to claw its way up my throat. When I finally borrowed a phone from a sympathetic stranger and called my mother's number, it went straight to voicemail. Marcus's phone? Voicemail? Emily's phone? Voicemail. Every single person in my family had turned off their devices or blocked my number, leaving me stranded in a foreign airport with nothing but a suitcase full of clothes and a credit card that I suddenly realized might not even work internationally. That's when the truth hit me like a freight train. This wasn't about teaching me a lesson or making me more responsible. This was about showing me what happened when I didn't fall in line, when I dared to live my own life instead of the one they'd scripted for me. What happened next shocked everyone, including me, because that's exactly when he appeared. He was standing about 10 feet away, leaning against a pillar with his arms crossed, watching the entire scene unfold with an expression that wasn't quite sympathy, but wasn't quite indifference either. His suit was the kind you only see in movies. Perfectly tailored, dark navy with subtle pinstripes, the kind that whispered wealth without shouting it. He had salt and pepper hair, sharp features, and eyes that seemed to calculate everything they observed, like he was constantly solving equations nobody else could see. When our eyes met, he didn't look away or pretend he hadn't been watching. He simply nodded once, as if acknowledging something we both understood without speaking. I was still standing there, frozen in that horrible space between denial and acceptance, when he walked over with the kind of confidence that makes crowds part without him asking. "Olivia Johnson," he said, not as a question but as a statement, and I felt my heart skip, because how did this stranger know my name? He gestured toward a quiet corner away from the gate area and said, "We should talk. You have about 45 minutes before that flight takes off, and I suspect you have some decisions to make. If you're watching this and thinking I should have run, hit that subscribe button and keep watching, because what this man offered me wasn't rescue. It was something far more valuable. Have you ever had someone see through a situation immediately and offer you exactly what you needed? Drop a like and let me know in the comments." His name was Robert Sterling, and he explained that he'd been standing nearby when my mother handed over my documents, when Emily took my phone, when I'd been systematically stripped of every tool I needed to function independently. He was a venture capitalist, he said, someone who'd built his entire career on reading people, identifying patterns, and recognizing when someone was being deliberately undermined. "Your family didn't abandon you on impulse," he told me, his voice steady and matter-of-fact. "This was planned, probably discussed, definitely coordinated. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" He didn't offer money or a ticket or even his phone. Instead, he offered me something nobody in my family ever had: the truth, delivered without sugarcoating, and the space to decide my own next move. But that's when things took a turn I never saw coming. Robert didn't wait for me to process what he'd just said. He simply pulled out his phone, made 2 quick calls in French that I couldn't fully understand, and then turned back to me with an expression that was equal parts business and curiosity. "I'm flying to London in 3 hours for a series of meetings that will determine whether a multi-million-dollar deal goes through or falls apart," he said, sliding his phone back into his pocket. "I need someone who can think on their feet, who understands family dynamics and manipulation, and who won't fall apart under pressure. You just demonstrated all 3 of those qualities in the last 20 minutes. I stared at him like he'd just spoken a different language, because what he was suggesting made absolutely no sense. Why would a billionaire offer a job to someone he'd just watched get abandoned by their own family? He explained that his business partner's wife had just backed out of the trip due to a family emergency, and her role had been crucial. She was supposed to help read the room during negotiations, provide insight into the interpersonal dynamics of the Chinese investment team they were meeting, and essentially be a second set of eyes on everything that wasn't being said out loud. "I don't need someone polished or trained," Robert continued, his eyes never leaving mine. "I need someone who's just been through psychological warfare and is angry enough to pay attention to every detail. People who've been manipulated recognize manipulation in others. It's like having a smoke detector that's already been tested by fire. The analogy was perfect, and despite the chaos swirling in my head, I understood exactly what he meant. The offer was simple, but strange. Fly with him to London, attend 3 days of meetings as an observer and informal consultant, and in exchange, he'd cover all expenses, plus pay me $5,000. But there was a catch, and he was completely transparent about it. I couldn't contact my family during those 3 days, couldn't tell them where I was or what I was doing, and had to commit fully to the role without distractions. If you spend those 72 hours trying to fix what just happened here, you'll be useless to me, he said bluntly. But if you spend them learning how power actually works, how people who respect themselves operate, you'll walk away with more than money. You'll walk away with perspective. Little did I know, this decision would completely reshape how I understood family, loyalty, and my own worth. I had 15 minutes to decide, and I spent the first 5 of them just staring at Robert like he might disappear if I blinked too hard. Every logical part of my brain was screaming that this was insane. You don't just fly to another country with a stranger, even a wealthy one in an expensive suit who seems to know exactly what he's talking about. But the other part of me, the part that was still reeling from watching my entire family board a plane without me, kept asking a different question. What exactly did I have to lose? My family had already made it clear that I was disposable, that my presence was conditional on obedience, and that they were willing to humiliate me publicly to prove a point. Going back to that life suddenly felt less like safety and more like surrender. Robert must have seen the shift in my expression because he nodded slightly, as if confirming something he'd already suspected. "Here's what I know about you just from watching," he said, his tone shifting from businesslike to almost conversational. "You didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't make a scene when you realized what they'd done. You tried to solve the problem logically, even when logic wasn't working. That tells me you've been trained to suppress your reactions, to manage other people's comfort above your own, and to believe that keeping the peace is more important than protecting yourself." Every word hit like a physical blow, because he was right. I'd spent my entire life trying to be the person my family needed me to be instead of the person I actually was. It's like running a race where someone keeps moving the finish line, and you eventually realize you're not supposed to win. You're just supposed to keep running. I took the deal. I signed a basic consulting agreement he had drawn up on his tablet, accepted a temporary advance to buy basic necessities since my suitcase was still in baggage claim limbo, and followed him through the airport toward the first-class lounge where we'd wait for his flight. As we walked, I felt something shift inside me. Not quite confidence, not quite relief, but something closer to clarity. For the first time in years, I was making a decision that nobody in my family had approved, guided, or controlled. I was stepping into complete uncertainty, but it was my uncertainty, my choice, my risk. What happened in London over those next 3 days would teach me more about power, respect, and self-worth than 28 years of family dinners ever had. But that's when the real lessons started. The first meeting happened in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the Thames, and I sat in the corner with a notepad, trying to look professional while my brain struggled to keep up with what was actually happening. Robert had introduced me simply as Olivia, my associate, without explanation or apology, and the 6 people around that table, 3 from Robert's investment firm, 3 from the Chinese tech company, simply accepted my presence without question. That's when I learned the first lesson. People who truly have power don't need to explain themselves to everyone in the room. They state facts, set boundaries, and move forward, trusting that their authority speaks for itself. My family had always operated differently. Every decision required unanimous approval, endless discussion, and elaborate justification, which I now realized wasn't democracy, but control disguised as consensus. I watched Robert navigate that meeting like a master chess player, never raising his voice, never pushing too hard, but somehow guiding every conversation exactly where he wanted it to go. When one of the Chinese investors made a thinly veiled threat about walking away from the deal, Robert didn't panic or scramble to accommodate. He simply leaned back, smiled slightly, and said, "That's certainly your choice, though I suspect your board would have questions about why you turned down a 40% return." The room went silent, and I realized he wasn't bluffing or posturing. He was stating objective reality and letting them draw their own conclusions. If you've ever been in a situation where someone tried to manipulate you with urgency or threats, make sure you're subscribed, because what I learned about handling that kind of pressure literally changed my life. Have you ever watched someone handle conflict with complete calm? Drop a like and let me know. After the meeting, Robert pulled me aside in the hallway and asked what I'd noticed. Not about the business terms, but about the people. I told him about the body language, the way the lead Chinese investor kept looking at his colleague for approval before speaking, the way Robert's own team seemed to anticipate his needs without him asking. "Good," he said, nodding. "Now tell me what that reminds you of." The answer hit me like ice water. It reminded me of my family dinners, of the way Emily and Marcus always looked to our parents before expressing an opinion, of the way I'd learned to read micro-expressions to predict when someone was about to shut me down. "Control systems look the same everywhere," Robert said quietly. "The difference is whether you're aware of them or trapped inside them. You just spent 2 hours watching people negotiate for millions of dollars using the same tactics your family used to decide where you'd go to college. That perspective shift was like putting on glasses for the first time and realizing you'd been seeing the world blurry your entire life." On the second day, Robert took me to a private dinner with one of his oldest friends, a woman named Margaret Chen, who ran a family foundation worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Over wine and perfectly prepared sea bass, Margaret told me her own story, how her parents had controlled her trust fund well into her 30s, how they'd used concern for her well-being to veto her business ideas, her choice of partner, even where she lived. "They called it protection," Margaret said, swirling her wine glass thoughtfully. "But protection from what? From making my own mistakes? From learning my own lessons? From becoming my own person?" She looked directly at me when she said that last part, and I felt something crack open inside my chest, because someone finally understood. Margaret explained that controlling families operate on a specific logic. They genuinely believe they're helping, that their experience and wisdom should override your autonomy, and that questioning their authority is evidence of your immaturity rather than their overreach. "The cruelest part," she continued, "is that they make you feel guilty for wanting independence. They frame your healthy desire for self-determination as selfishness, ingratitude, or emotional instability." I thought about my mother's favorite phrase whenever I pushed back on their decisions. "We're just worried about you, honey. You know you don't always think things through." At the time, I'd believed her. I'd internalized the idea that my judgment was flawed, that I needed their oversight, that wanting space was somehow proof I wasn't ready for it. Now I realized that was the trap itself. Robert had been quiet during most of the dinner, but as we left the restaurant, he said something that rewired my entire understanding of family loyalty. The people who love you want you to succeed even if that success takes you away from them. The people who control you want you to stay even if staying destroys you. It's like the difference between a greenhouse that protects plants while they grow versus a cage that keeps birds from ever learning to fly. My family had convinced me their cage was a greenhouse, that their limitations were protection, and that my desire to leave was a character flaw rather than a natural developmental need. Walking back to the hotel that night, I started making a mental list of every decision they'd overridden, every dream they'd dismissed, every time they'd reframed my autonomy as evidence of my inadequacy. The list was longer than I wanted to admit. By the third day, something had shifted in how Robert treated me. I wasn't just observing anymore, I was actively participating. During a crucial negotiation over intellectual property rights, he asked me directly what I thought about the lead investor's body language when discussing timeline concerns. I told him that the man kept glancing at his watch and checking his phone, which suggested he was either genuinely pressed for time or performing urgency to create pressure. Robert smiled and adjusted his entire strategy on the spot, slowing down the conversation and suggesting we reconvene the next morning when everyone could give this the attention it deserves. The Chinese team agreed immediately, and later Robert told me that single observation had saved him from making concessions under artificial time pressure. That moment did something to me that years of family dinners never had. It showed me that my instincts were not only valid, but valuable. My whole life I'd been told I was too sensitive, that I read too much into things, that my observations about people and dynamics were overthinking rather than insight. But in that conference room, the same skills my family had dismissed as weaknesses became assets worth thousands of dollars. Robert started asking my opinion before major decisions, not because he needed permission, but because he genuinely valued a different perspective. It's like spending years being told you're tone deaf and then discovering you actually have perfect pitch. The skill was always there, but nobody had bothered to listen. On our last evening in London, Robert handed me an envelope with my payment plus a bonus. And then he said something I'll never forget. Your family trained you to doubt yourself because confident people are harder to control. Everything you did this week, the observation, the analysis, the quick thinking, those aren't new skills. You've been using them your entire life to navigate their manipulation. You just never had permission to trust them before. I sat there in that hotel lobby, holding that envelope, and realized he was absolutely right. I'd been competent all along. I'd managed complex family dynamics, predicted reactions, solved problems, and maintained peace in impossible situations. The only difference was that now someone was calling it competence instead of neurosis, strategy instead of anxiety, intelligence instead of oversensitivity. What happened when I finally returned home would test everything I'd learned. I didn't contact my family for those entire 3 days, just like Robert had required, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't think about them constantly. Part of me expected frantic messages, worried calls, some evidence that they'd realized their cruelty had gone too far. Instead, when I finally turned on my phone at Heathrow before my flight back to the States, I found something far worse. A carefully constructed group chat where they'd spent the past 72 hours rewriting the entire narrative. According to their messages, I'd had an episode at the airport, become unstable and aggressive, and they'd been forced to continue without me for everyone's safety. Emily had even posted pictures from Paris with captions about family healing and necessary boundaries. The gaslighting was so thorough, so coordinated, that if I hadn't lived through the actual events, I might have believed their version myself. Marcus had sent a long message about how they'd tried everything to help me, but I refused to get professional help. My mother had written about the heartbreak of watching a child spiral and making the impossible choice to prioritize the rest of the family's well-being. They'd painted themselves as victims of my instability and their abandonment as an act of loving intervention. It was masterful, really. They'd turned their cruelty into martyrdom and my justified anger into evidence of mental illness. If you've ever had someone rewrite history to make themselves the hero of your trauma, hit that subscribe button because what I did next is exactly what they never saw coming. Have you ever been gaslit by people who claim to love you? Let me know in the comments and drop a like if this hits home. But here's what they didn't know. During those 3 days in London, I'd documented everything. I had the original email confirmations showing I'd purchased my own ticket before they gifted the trip. I had text messages where my mother specifically asked to hold my documents. I had timestamps proving exactly when they'd boarded that plane and when I'd been told no ticket existed. Robert had actually suggested I gather this evidence, not for revenge, but for clarity. When people try to rewrite reality, he'd said, documentation is your anchor to the truth. I sat in that airport terminal, reading their elaborate fiction, and felt something I'd never felt before toward my family. Not anger, not even hurt, but complete clarity about who they actually were versus who I'd needed them to be. The confrontation was inevitable, but this time, I wouldn't be walking in unarmed. I didn't rush home immediately. Instead, I stayed with a friend in New York for 2 days, carefully planning exactly how this conversation would go. My family expected me to come back apologetic, confused, maybe even believing their version of events enough to question my own memory. They expected tears, explanations, desperate attempts to prove I wasn't the unstable person they'd painted me as. What they didn't expect was silence, followed by precision. I sent a single message to the group chat. We need to talk. Sunday at 2 p.m. at Mom and Dad's house. I'll be there, and I expect all of you to be there too. No emotion, no accusations, just a clear statement of expectation. Marcus responded within minutes trying to set conditions, but I didn't engage. I just repeated the time and place. When I walked into that living room, they were all sitting there with expressions ranging from defensive concern to outright hostility. My father, Richard, started with his usual approach. Olivia, we've all been so worried about you. Where have you been? Why didn't you answer our calls? I sat down calmly, pulled out my tablet, and said 6 words that changed the entire energy in the room. Let's talk about what actually happened. Then I played the recording. Yes, I'd recorded the gate agent telling me there was no ticket. Recorded my attempts to reach them. Recorded the exact timeline of events. I showed them the original purchase confirmations, the text messages, the documented proof that their narrative was fiction. The silence that followed was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. Emily tried first, her voice taking on that trembling quality she always used when she wanted sympathy. Olivia, you're clearly upset, but you're misunderstanding the situation? I held up my hand, and to my surprise, she actually stopped talking. I'm going to say this once, I said, keeping my voice level and calm. You don't get to rewrite what happened. You don't get to call my memory an episode or my anger instability. You abandoned me in a foreign country as punishment for not living the life you wanted me to live, and then you lied about it to make yourselves feel better. My mother started to cry, which was her go-to manipulation tactic, but this time I didn't rush to comfort her. I just waited. And in that waiting, something shifted. For the first time in my life, I wasn't managing their emotions. I was stating my reality and letting them sit with it. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of how everything would unravel. My father was the first one to drop the act completely. He stood up, his face going red in that way it always did when someone challenged his authority, and said what they'd all been thinking but never saying out loud. You've always been difficult, Olivia. Always questioning, always pushing back, always acting like you know better than people who've lived decades longer than you. We thought leaving you behind might finally teach you some humility, some gratitude for everything we've done for you. The honesty was almost refreshing. No more pretending this was about my well-being or their concern. This was about control, pure and simple, and I'd committed the unforgivable sin of wanting to exist outside of it. Marcus jumped in next, and his words were even more revealing. Do you have any idea how exhausting it is to constantly worry about what you're going to do next? What job you're going to quit? What city you're going to move to? What decision you're going to make that we'll have to clean up later? I realized in that moment that they'd never actually cleaned up anything for me. I'd been financially independent since college, had never asked them for money or rescue, had built my entire life without their direct support. What Marcus called cleaning up was actually just their disappointment that I didn't consult them before every life choice. They wanted credit for problems they'd invented, appreciation for help I'd never needed, and control over a life they'd never actually supported. It's like claiming you saved someone from drowning when you were the one who pushed them in the pool. Jennifer, Marcus's wife, who usually stayed quiet during family drama, surprised everyone by speaking up. Honestly, Olivia, you should be thanking them. You got a free trip to Paris, and now you're acting like you're the victim because they didn't want to enable your impulsive behavior. That's when everything clicked into place. This wasn't just my parents and siblings. This was an entire family system that had agreed on a narrative where my independence was instability, my boundaries were selfishness, and their control was love. They had all bought into this story so completely that my evidence, my documentation, my literal proof meant nothing compared to their collective certainty that they were right. I stood up, grabbed my tablet, and said something I'd never said before. I'm done trying to make you understand. Believe whatever you need to believe, but I'm not participating in this anymore. What happened next shocked everyone, including me. As I turned to leave, my grandmother, Catherine, my father's mother who'd been sitting quietly in the corner the entire time, spoke up with a voice that cut through the chaos like a blade. Sit down, all of you. Everyone froze because my grandmother rarely inserted herself into family conflicts, but when she did, even my father listened. She looked at me with eyes that held something I'd never seen before. Recognition, maybe even pride. And then she turned to the rest of the family with an expression that was pure steel. I've watched you do this to her for years, and I stayed quiet because I thought you'd eventually see what you were doing. But this? She gestured at the room, at all of them. This is cruelty disguised as concern, and I won't be silent anymore. My grandmother told them a story I'd never heard before, about how my grandfather had tried to control every aspect of her life when they were first married, how he'd dismissed her intelligence, questioned her judgment, and made her feel incompetent at every turn. "I stayed for 40 years, she said, her voice heavy with regret. "I let him convince me that his control was protection, that his doubt was wisdom, that my desire for independence was selfishness. And you know what I learned?" She looked directly at my father. "I learned that you inherited every single one of his tactics, Richard, and you passed them down to your children like they were family values instead of trauma." The room was so silent you could hear the clock ticking in the hallway. Catherine stood up and walked over to me, placing her hand on my shoulder in a gesture that felt like permission and protection all at once. "Your grandfather died believing he'd been a good husband because I never left, never challenged him, never stopped managing his emotions at the expense of my own. I will not watch Olivia make the same mistake I did." She turned back to my parents, to Marcus and Emily. "You think abandoning her in Paris was justified? You think gaslighting her about what happened makes you righteous? You're not protecting her. You're punishing her for having the courage I never had." Then she looked at me and said the words that changed everything. "You don't owe them access to a life they refuse to respect. Not proximity, not explanations, not forgiveness. Nothing." But that's when things took a turn none of us saw coming. My father's face had gone from red to pale, and when he finally spoke, his voice was shaking with barely controlled rage. "Mother, you don't understand the full situation. Olivia has been irresponsible with—" But Catherine cut him off with a laugh that had no humor in it whatsoever. "Oh, I understand perfectly, Richard. I understand that 3 months ago, you called me asking to borrow money from Olivia's trust fund because Marcus's business was failing and you didn't want to tell him no." The air left the room like someone had opened an airlock, and I felt my entire body go cold. What trust fund? I'd never known anything about a trust fund. Catherine explained what I should have been told years ago. My grandfather had left me a substantial inheritance when he died, money that was supposed to be released to me when I turned 25. But my parents had convinced her to keep it in trust until I was more stable, which apparently meant more compliant. They'd been using my supposed financial irresponsibility as justification, pointing to things like my decision to take a lower-paying job I actually enjoyed instead of the corporate position they'd wanted me to take. "They told me you couldn't be trusted with money," Catherine said, her voice breaking slightly. "They showed me budgets, spreadsheets, examples of your poor choices, and I believed them because I wanted to believe they had your best interest at heart." The amount she mentioned made my knees weak. Over $300,000 that had been sitting in an account with my name on it, controlled entirely by my parents through a clause my grandmother had added at their insistence. Marcus had gone completely white, and I realized with sickening clarity that the Paris trip, the abandonment, all of it, it wasn't just about control. It was about making sure I never found out about the money they'd been treating like their own emergency fund. "How much?" I asked Catherine, my voice barely above a whisper. "How much did they borrow from my inheritance?" She looked at my father with disgust before answering, $85,000. They were supposed to pay it back within 6 months. That was 14 months ago. The room exploded into chaos, but I felt something completely unexpected. Relief that I finally understood what this was really about. Marcus stood up so fast his chair fell backwards, and for the first time in my life, I saw my perfect older brother completely unravel. "This is insane!" he shouted, pointing at Catherine like she was the enemy. "You're taking her side after everything we've done to try and help her? After all the family dinners where she caused drama, all the holidays she ruined with her attitude, all the times we had to cover for her instability?" But his voice was too loud, too desperate, and I recognized it immediately. This was the same performance he'd used when we were kids, and he'd gotten caught doing something wrong. He'd create chaos, escalate the emotions, and redirect blame until everyone forgot what the original problem was. It had worked for 30 years, but not anymore. Catherine didn't raise her voice, didn't engage with his theatrics. She simply pulled out her phone and showed him something that made all the color drain from his face. "Your wife Jennifer called me last week," she said calmly. "She told me everything. About the failed real estate investments, about the gambling debts, about how you've been borrowing from anyone in the family who would lend to you. Jennifer had apparently reached her breaking point and confessed the whole truth to my grandmother, including how my parents had orchestrated the Paris abandonment specifically to keep me distracted and angry enough that I wouldn't start asking questions about my finances. They needed you isolated, Catherine continued, looking at me now. They needed you to feel unstable, to doubt yourself, to be so focused on their rejection that you'd never notice the missing money. Emily started crying then, real tears this time, not the manipulative kind. And between sobs, she said something that broke my heart. I didn't want to do it. I told them it was wrong, but Dad said if we didn't all stick together, the family would fall apart. She was 24 years old, still living at home, still completely under our parents' control, and I realized she'd been another victim in this, just one who'd chosen compliance over resistance. They told me you were getting an inheritance and that it wasn't fair, Emily continued, her voice shaking. They said you'd waste it, that Marcus needed it more because he was actually trying to build something. I believed them because I wanted to believe that there was a good reason for what we did to you. It's like watching someone realize they've been fighting on the wrong side of a war, the guilt and confusion and anger all crashing together at once. My mother had been silent through all of this, but when she finally spoke, her voice was cold in a way I'd never heard before. You can judge us all you want, Olivia, but everything we did was to protect this family. Marcus made mistakes, yes, but families help each other. That's what you've never understood. It's not about you as an individual. It's about us as a unit. And there it was, the fundamental difference in how we saw the world. To her, family meant absorption. Everyone's needs melded together under the authority of the parents, with individual desires sacrificed for collective stability. To me, family meant support. Separate people who chose to care for each other without erasing their own identities in the process. We were speaking different languages, and I finally understood we always had been. I looked at my father, at Marcus, at my mother's rigid expression, and I felt something settle in my chest like a key turning in a lock. I want every dollar returned to my account within 30 days, I said, my voice steady and clear. I want documentation of exactly where the money went, and a repayment plan for the full amount. And I want it in writing that you no longer have any access to or control over my trust fund. My father started to speak, but I held up my hand. If you don't agree to these terms, I'm calling a lawyer tomorrow morning, and this becomes a legal matter instead of a family one. Your choice. The power in that moment wasn't from anger or revenge. It was from finally understanding that I didn't need their permission to protect myself. Catherine reached into her purse and pulled out paperwork I recognized as legal documents. I had my attorney draw these up last week, she said, handing them to me. Complete transfer of control over your trust fund, effective immediately. The only signature needed is yours. She'd known this confrontation was coming, had prepared for it, had chosen my autonomy over their control. My father looked at his own mother with something close to betrayal, but Catherine's expression was resolute. I enabled this for too long, Richard. I won't enable it anymore. I signed those papers right there in that living room, and with each stroke of the pen, I felt decades of doubt and self-questioning fall away. What happened in the weeks that followed would test everything I'd learned about standing firm. The first week after that confrontation was the quietest my phone had ever been. No group chats, no passive-aggressive texts disguised as concern, no calls from Emily crying about how I was tearing the family apart. Just silence, thick, heavy silence, that felt both liberating and terrifying at the same time. My parents had hired a lawyer who sent a formal letter claiming the money taken from my trust was a family loan that I'd verbally agreed to, which was such an absurd lie that even their attorney seemed embarrassed by it. Catherine's lawyer responded with timestamps, documentation, and a very polite threat about filing for elder financial abuse since my parents had manipulated her into giving them access to funds that weren't theirs. The legal posturing lasted exactly 4 days before they agreed to a repayment plan. Marcus called me once during that first week, his voice carrying none of its usual confidence or condescension. "I'm sorry," he said, and for a moment I thought maybe there was hope for some kind of reconciliation. But then he continued, "I'm sorry you felt the need to air our family's private business to lawyers and make this into something ugly. We could have worked this out internally if you'd just been willing to compromise." That word, compromise, told me everything I needed to know. To him, compromise meant me accepting less than what I was owed, accepting their narrative about my instability, accepting ongoing control in exchange for partial justice. I told him what I should have said years ago. I don't compromise with people who steal from me. I don't negotiate with people who gaslight me. And I don't owe you a relationship just because we share DNA. Then I hung up. Emily's response was different. She sent me a long email 3 weeks after the confrontation, and reading it felt like watching someone wake up from a nightmare in real time. She wrote about how she'd started therapy, how she was realizing that our parents' control had shaped her entire identity, how she'd never learned to make a decision without checking if it would make them angry first. "I'm not ready to leave yet," she admitted. "I'm still too scared, still too dependent on them financially and emotionally. But watching you do it, watching you just walk away and survive, it's showing me that maybe I could too, eventually." I didn't respond immediately because I needed to figure out what kind of relationship was possible with someone who'd participated in my abuse, but was now trying to break free from her own. It's like being asked to help someone escape from a burning building while they're still holding the matches that started the fire. 2 months after the confrontation, I got an email from Robert Sterling, the billionaire from the airport who'd given me those 3 transformative days in London. "I heard through my network about what happened with your family," he wrote. "Your grandmother Catherine and I have mutual friends, and she mentioned you might be looking for new opportunities. I have a proposition if you're interested." We met for coffee in Manhattan, and he explained that his venture capital firm was expanding their team focused on identifying promising startups, led by founders from non-traditional backgrounds. "I need someone who understands power dynamics, who can spot manipulation and control disguised as mentorship, who can recognize when an investor is genuinely supportive versus when they're positioning for takeover," he said. "Everything you've lived through makes you uniquely qualified for this work." The position came with a salary that was almost double what I'd been making, equity in the firm, and something even more valuable: autonomy. Robert was clear that he wasn't offering rescue or charity. He was offering a business partnership based on skills I'd proven I possessed. "You're going to be evaluating deals worth millions of dollars," he explained. "You're going to sit across from founders at their most vulnerable and help determine if we invest or walk away. That requires someone who understands vulnerability without exploiting it, someone who's been underestimated and knows how to see potential others miss." The irony wasn't lost on me. My family had spent years telling me I lacked judgment, stability, and professional credibility. And now, someone was offering me a position specifically because of the wisdom I'd gained from surviving their dysfunction. I accepted the job, and within 6 months I was traveling internationally, meeting extraordinary people building companies from scratch, and using every single skill my family had trained me to have for entirely different purposes. The ability to read a room? Essential for negotiations. The capacity to manage others' emotions while protecting my own? Critical for difficult conversations with founders. The experience of having my reality questioned made me fierce about believing people when they describe their own experiences and obstacles. It's like spending years learning a language under duress, and then discovering you can use that language to write poetry, instead of just surviving conversations. My family had equipped me for this work without meaning to, and that accidental gift became my greatest professional asset. 6 months into my new job, during a late night in a hotel room in Singapore, I wrote a letter to my parents that I never intended to send. It was 10 pages long, single-spaced, and it said everything I'd never been allowed to say growing up. I wrote about the birthday parties where my accomplishments were minimized because they made Marcus look bad. I wrote about the times they'd shared my private struggles with extended family as evidence of my instability. I wrote about how they'd taught me that love was conditional on compliance, that safety required silence, and that family loyalty meant accepting mistreatment without complaint. Writing it all out felt like performing surgery on myself, painful, necessary, and somehow clarifying in a way that talking had never been. The letter wasn't angry in the way they would have expected. It wasn't full of accusations or blame or demands for apology. Instead, it was honest about the cost of their choices, about what I'd lost by spending 28 years trying to earn approval from people who'd designed the system so I could never succeed. You taught me to doubt every instinct, question every achievement, and apologize for every boundary, I wrote. You called it parenting. I call it what it actually was. Systematic erosion of self-trust disguised as guidance. I described the panic attacks I'd had in my early 20s, the relationships I'd sabotaged because I didn't believe I deserved respect, the opportunities I'd turned down because their voices in my head were louder than my own desires. I told them exactly what their control had cost me, not to make them feel guilty, but to make myself see the truth clearly. The final paragraph was the hardest to write. I'm not sending this letter because I don't need you to understand anymore. I don't need validation for my reality, acknowledgement of the harm, or admission that you were wrong. I needed those things for years, and the waiting nearly destroyed me. Now I understand that some people will never see what they did, and my healing can't depend on their insight. This letter is for me, proof that I know what happened, that I trust my own memory, that I survived something real and came out stronger. You don't get to be part of that story anymore unless you choose honesty over image, accountability over control. The door is open if you ever want to walk through it differently, but I'm not waiting on the other side anymore. I saved the letter in a folder on my laptop titled Evidence of Growth and never opened it again. But writing it changed something fundamental. It gave me permission to stop seeking their approval for my own life story. Emily reached out 13 months after the confrontation, and this time her voice on the phone sounded different. Clearer, stronger, more certain. I moved out, she said simply. I got my own apartment, started paying my own bills, and told Mom and Dad I needed space to figure out who I am without their input. She'd been in therapy twice a week, working through the same patterns of control and manipulation that had defined both our childhoods, and she wanted to meet in person to apologize properly. We met at a neutral coffee shop halfway between our apartments, and for the first time in our lives, we talked to each other as individuals rather than as players in our family's drama. She cried when she described how she'd participated in the Paris abandonment, how the guilt had eaten at her until she couldn't sleep, how she'd finally understood that protecting the family system had meant betraying her own sister. I didn't forgive her immediately because forgiveness isn't something you can rush or fake, but I told her something that felt more important. I see you trying. I see you doing the work to break the patterns. That matters more than an apology for what happened when you were still trapped in their control. Emily told me about the realization that had finally pushed her to leave. She'd been at a family dinner where our parents were criticizing her new job, picking apart her choices, and she'd heard herself defending them using the exact same language they'd used to defend abandoning me. I sounded just like them, she said, her voice shaking. I was becoming them, and I realized if I didn't leave, I'd end up doing to my own future kids what they did to us. It's like watching someone realize they're standing in quicksand. The panic, the desperate scramble to get to solid ground, the recognition that staying still means sinking. We started meeting for coffee every few weeks, carefully building a relationship that existed outside our family's influence. Emily asked questions about my job, my life, my boundaries, and she actually listened to the answers without trying to fix or judge or redirect. She told me about her therapy sessions, about learning that she'd never developed her own opinions because she'd been too busy adopting our parents' views to stay safe. I don't even know what kind of music I like, she admitted one afternoon. Genuinely like because it speaks to me, not because someone told me it was good or sophisticated or appropriate. So we spent the next month going to random concerts together. Jazz, metal, indie folk, everything. And watching her discover her own preferences was like witnessing someone learn to use a sense they didn't know they had. Our relationship would never be what it could have been if we'd grown up differently, but it was becoming something real, something chosen, something built on honesty, instead of survival. The call came from Marcus 18 months after the confrontation, and his voice was so broken I almost didn't recognize it. Jennifer had filed for divorce, citing his gambling addiction and financial deception as irrecoverable breaches of trust. Our parents had refused to help him with legal fees because he'd made his own bed, which was almost funny considering they'd funded and enabled his poor decisions for years. I lost everything, Liv, he said, using the nickname he hadn't called me since we were kids. The house, the business, my marriage, my kids' respect. And the worst part is, I deserved all of it. He wasn't calling to ask for money or help. He was calling because his therapist had suggested he make amends to the people he'd hurt, and I was at the top of that list. Marcus told me things I'd never known. How our father had convinced him that his worth was tied to being successful, that any failure made him less valuable as a son, that asking for help was weakness, and hiding problems was strength. I borrowed from your trust fund because I genuinely believed I'd pay it back double, he explained. I believed my own hype about being a great businessman, and I thought if I could just get past this one rough patch, I'd prove Dad right about me and you wrong for walking away. The desperation in his voice was familiar because I'd heard it in my own thoughts for years. That frantic need to earn approval from people who'd set up impossible standards. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Marcus continued. I just needed you to know that you were right. About them, about the control, about all of it. And I'm sorry it took losing everything for me to see it. I didn't absolve him or offer comfort, but I did tell him the truth. I hope you find your way out of this, Marcus. I hope you figure out who you are when you're not performing for them. But that's work you have to do for yourself, not for redemption or relationship with me. He accepted that with more grace than I expected, and we ended the call with an understanding that maybe someday we could rebuild something, but not now. Not while he was still figuring out how to stand on his own. 3 months later, Emily told me Marcus had moved to Oregon, cut off contact with our parents entirely, and was working as a construction manager. Honest work for honest pay, no pretense, no performance. She said he seemed lighter somehow, like he'd been carrying a weight he didn't know how to put down until it crushed him completely. Sometimes people need to break before they can rebuild themselves into something real. 2 years after the confrontation, my parents made one final attempt to reassert control, and it was so perfectly characteristic of them that I almost had to admire the consistency. They sent a formal letter through their attorney stating that they were planning a family reconciliation gathering for my grandmother Catherine's 80th birthday, and my attendance was expected as a matter of respect and family obligation. The letter went on to outline conditions for my participation. I would need to let go of past grievances, acknowledge my role in the family conflict, and commit to rebuilding trust through consistent engagement. It was control dressed up as invitation, manipulation packaged as reconciliation, and the same old pattern of demanding my compliance while offering nothing in return, except access to people who'd proven they didn't respect me. I didn't respond to the letter because it didn't deserve a response, but I did call my grandmother directly to wish her a happy birthday and explain why I wouldn't be attending their performance of family unity. I know, sweetheart, Catherine said with a tired laugh. I told them not to do this, that you'd see right through it, but they're convinced that enough time has passed that you'll have forgotten what actually happened. She'd declined to let them host the party at all, once she understood it was a trap designed to force me back into the family system. We're having lunch, just you and me on my actual birthday, she said firmly. They can have their reconciliation theater without using my celebration as the stage. It's like watching someone finally refuse to let their house be used for a crime. Catherine had spent years enabling their behavior through silence, but she wasn't willing to be a prop in their manipulation anymore. The day of their planned gathering, I was in Tokyo meeting with a startup founder who'd built an incredible company helping trauma survivors find employment. My phone buzzed with messages from extended family members who'd been told I'd refused to attend Grandma's birthday, painting me once again as the selfish one, the difficult one, the one who valued grudges over family. I didn't defend myself or correct the narrative because I'd learned that people who want to believe their version will find evidence to support it no matter what I say. Instead, I posted a photo of the birthday lunch I'd had with Catherine the week before. Just the two of us, genuine smiles, no performance, with a caption that said simply, "Celebrating the people who choose honesty over image." My grandmother commented within minutes, "Best birthday I've had in years." That said everything that needed to be said. Here's what nobody tells you about revenge when you've been betrayed by family. The sweetest revenge isn't destruction or public exposure or making them suffer the way they made you suffer. The sweetest revenge is building a life so authentic, so aligned with your actual values, that their opinion of it becomes irrelevant. 2.5 years after they abandoned me in that Paris airport, I'm thriving in ways they said I never would. I'm financially independent, professionally successful, and surrounded by people who respect my boundaries instead of punishing me for having them. The trust fund they tried to control is now funding my own investment in companies led by people who've been underestimated, and every dollar I invest feels like transforming their theft into someone else's opportunity. My parents occasionally send emails through relatives, always phrased as concern but really asking the same question: when will you come back and let us pretend this never happened? The answer is never, not because I'm holding a grudge, but because I finally understand that some doors need to stay closed for your own protection. Marcus is rebuilding his life in Oregon, and we text occasionally, surface-level stuff, but honest, which is more than we ever had before. Emily and I have coffee every month, and watching her discover who she is outside their control has been one of the unexpected gifts of this whole nightmare. Catherine and I have dinner every Sunday, and she tells me stories about her own journey to autonomy that she never felt safe sharing when my grandfather was alive. These relationships exist because people chose growth over comfort, truth over image, accountability over defensiveness. After hearing my story, what would you have done in my place? Would you have taken Robert's offer and disappeared for 3 days? Or would you have rushed back to fix things with your family immediately? Do you think I was wrong for cutting off contact? Or do you believe some relationships become toxic enough that distance is the only healthy option? What's your take on family loyalty when family members use that loyalty as a weapon? I genuinely want to know what you think, because stories like mine exist in that complicated space where there's no perfect answer, just choices that either honor your dignity or sacrifice it for someone else's comfort. If you want more stories about breaking free from control, standing up for yourself, and building a life that actually belongs to you, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Don't miss the next video where I'll share the specific strategies I use to rebuild my self-trust after years of gaslighting. You won't want to miss it. I'll see you in the next video.